Gyfu gomena bif gleng and Helenes, Rathu and Wifshipper and Lachna Yuam, all on that wisp if they offer layas.
Wēsaþ hale und bēoþ wilcuman. Welcome back to part 3 of this Wyrdwayz episode about the Anglo Saxon rune Gyfu. Now firstly, I would like to start by thanking all of my subscribers. Your support really is very much appreciated. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It's great to see your comments, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. And of course, if you're feeling generous, please check out my Patreon and support me on there, because that is really very much appreciated. Right, okay, so let's get straight into part 3 of this episode. First ever time I've actually done a part 3. So what I want to do in this episode is actually look at the shape of the rune and see what we can extract from that. So let's have a look, shall we? I've got my recently, well, actually only completed it this week, been working on it for a while, my rune staff, which is carved with all of the Anglo Saxon runes. So let's find this rune. Here it is here. There, so this is Gyfu. Okay, and as you can see, it's a cross. So let's talk about the shape of the rune. Now, crossroads appear within the magical traditions of many cultures. Now, symbolically, they are liminal spaces, a space between the worlds, betwixt and between, and therefore they're considered places where spirits can be contacted, where gods can be contacted more easily. Now, there are also places where sacrifices and offerings are made and have been made for a long time. For example, in Greece, what we find is that crossroads were places where Hecate and Hermes were revered and were thought to be sacred to those deities. And shrines were often placed at crossroads and rituals conducted there. Now in England, there's a deep folklore connected with crossroads. Now, traditionally, they're places where gallows were erected and people were hung, which actually just makes me think that is kind of interesting, because this is a rune where you can use to contact the gods, and obviously Woden, Hangatir, he is the god of the hanged, as I've mentioned before. But they were also actually places where the bodies of suicide victims were buried. they were seen as having committed a gross crime by effectively murdering themselves, and so their bodies were often placed at crossroads. In fact, in England, bodies were buried by the roadside, and there is actually some connection between witches and being buried at the roadside, but we won't go into that today. But it could be that they were placed at crossroads because they were a demarcation point between places. They were boundary places. But some people believe that their bodies were placed there so that their ghost would get confused and not be able to find its way back home. And of course there are parallels there to Norse beliefs, but again I haven't got time to go into that today. Now, in traditional British witchcraft, crossroads are places where it is thought that you can summon the devil. And I just thought it might be worth mentioning that the word which is associated with the devil in traditional British witchcraft, bucca, is actually an Anglo Saxon word which means a he-goat. Anyway, I'm sure there's a whole other story that I can tell about that, but haven't got time. Anyway, let's get back to the shape of this rune, shall we? Now, there are definite sacrificial qualities to this rune, not just by virtue of its shape. So the Lord, if we go back to what we looked at in the earlier parts of this episode, the Lord sacrifices treasure, weapons, gifts, land to his retainers. And the retainers, well, they may be required to sacrifice their life for their Lord. So there are many sacrificial qualities to this rune, and obviously the shape expresses that and confirms it. Now, liminal spaces have long been associated with sacrificial offerings, and places generally considered good liminal spaces for these offerings are watery places. And that is why I have trekked. If I look a bit dishevelled, it's because I honestly didn't think I was going to get here. I had to wade through what felt like miles of cow parsley jungles whilst carrying far more than I could comfortably manage to get here, and covered in mud. But hey, we're here, and I came here today because I'm sat just at the top of a beautiful little Somerset waterfall, and I wanted to come here today for the wateriness of it, because that is what I'm going to be talking about in this episode. So yes, liminal spaces, watery spaces, there's a very long and deep Indo-European tradition of these places being used for ritual deposits, and wetlands. You know, wetlands have been the final resting place for objects that have been placed, votive offerings that have been placed in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, really from the 4th century before Common Era right through to the end of the Viking period. So this is a tradition which has endured for thousands of years that we have evidence of. Now, the majority of these offerings were actually placed into their final watery resting place during the 3rd and the 4th centuries Common Era. Okay, so basically these consist of thousands, absolutely thousands of weapons, some of which have first been deliberately damaged before they've been deposited. There's also evidence of animals, of humans, so a great number of things would have been sacrificed to these watery places. Now, we'll have a look at this timeline, but what you can see is this tradition started in prehistory. So before the Bronze Age, there's evidence of these ritual deposits. So during the Bronze Age, we see really impressive large hoards that were sacrificed in these wetland liminal spaces, you know, weapons, jewellery and cult objects. And then moving into the Iron Age, again, large ritual deposits continue to be made during this time. You know, absolutely vast quantities of weapons, which are presumed to have come from defeated armies. Humans, cauldrons, wagons, tools. So a great variety of objects have been sacrificed into these wetland liminal spaces. Now this is part of a very extensive water cult, you know, which can be found throughout most of Northern Europe prehistory. So if we move into the period that we're concerned with now, the migration period and beyond, and for now we'll stay looking at examples from Scandinavia as a point of reference. So what we can see is, compared to the earlier deposits, the deposits of later period were nowhere near as large or on the same scale. Items were given to the water either singularly or as part of a small hoard. Now, while we often see objects from the earlier period having been deliberately damaged before they were deposited, the deposits of the later period, the migration period, tend to be, and beyond, tend to be intact, unbroken. So during the 5th and the first half of the 6th century, we see deposits being made into these wetland liminal spaces, things like bracteates and fibulae. Now, what happens then is interesting, because the deposits then stop, and we have a period where no deposits, no ritual deposits into watery spaces have been found. But then they start again in the late 8th century. And they then continue to the beginning of the 11th century. So this is the Viking period. So during this time, the people of Scandinavia once again revert to the customs of their ancestors, and these weapons, jewellery are again deposited into these watery spaces. So far I've been talking about Scandinavia. Let's hop across the North Sea, shall we, and now talk about what was going on in England. Now, what we find in England is that there were plenty of votive offerings made into watery spaces in the period before the Anglo Saxon migration period. So rivers, springs, fens, wells. You know, the people that were living in this country prior to the Anglo-Saxon migration, they were making these deposits into these watery spaces. So it was a common practice here from the indigenous people before the Anglo-Saxons came to this country. Now, as for the early Anglo-Saxon period, well, quite frankly, there have been far too many objects found in watery places for it to be a considered accidental loss. So I think it's fair to say that the people that came here from their Germanic homelands, they did continue with this practice of making offerings into watery spaces. So what kind of objects have been found? As in Scandinavia, the vast majority of the objects that have been found have been weapons, but there's also been jewellery and tools. Now, as with what happened in Scandinavia, the quantity of the finds does decrease in England in between the 6th and the 8th centuries. But what the finds from English rivers show us is that there is a continuation of this ritual behaviour all the way from the 4th until the 11th century. So while these ritual deposits decreased at the same time that they did in Scandinavia, they still continued to happen in this country, which is obviously interesting because this is meant to be the period where this country was Christianized. Now, as an example of these watery deposits, more than 100 spearheads have been found in 25 different places in the River Thames. Now, these finds are dominated by spearheads from the 5th and 6th centuries. However, there are examples, though in smaller quantities, from both the previous and the following centuries. So the majority are the 5th and 6th centuries, but there were deposits made throughout the whole period. Now, rivers where spearheads of this era have been found, apart from the Thames, include the River Cherwell, the River Kennet and the River Wey. Now, this is interesting, at least I find it interesting, hopefully you will as well. Now, we know that the Anglo Saxons were making ritual deposits during rivers in the 5th and 6th centuries. In other words, they were still pagan. They were continuing with the pagan practices of their ancestors, and you know, this was before Augustine arrived on the Kent coast with a mission of Christian conversion. Now, although the numbers did decrease during the 7th and 8th centuries, as I said, they did continue, but on a smaller scale. Now, when we think about it, you know, the conversion of this country to Christianity was a long and drawn out process. It wasn't just one day they flicked a switch and everyone went Christian. It wasn't a smooth transition, and people, particularly the common ordinary people, would have continued with these practices regardless of whether somebody at the top was telling them that they now needed to worship another god. I mean, really, it took a long time until we have institutionalised Christianity in this country, and it probably didn't happen until the 8th century. I mean, the fact that the English lords of Canute, who ruled from 1016 to 1035, so we're talking not long before the Norman invasion, the fact that his laws prohibited pagan ritual and you know, including the veneration of rivers and wells, shows that this pagan faith and these pagan practices were kind of flourishing. You know, the fact that the leaders had to tell them to stop doing it does show that they were still doing it. So this is very interesting. So deposits were being made happily into rivers. The 5th and the 6th centuries dropped off a little bit. Augustine arrives in 597. So then for the next couple of centuries, the number of ritual deposits into watery places does kind of decline, but it doesn't stop. Now, in the 9th century, the great heathen army conquered the kingdom of East Anglia, and well, to cut a long story short, the result was the Danelaw, where England would have been home to many Scandinavian families who were heathen. Now, what we then see happening in England is a re-blossoming of this tradition, this practice of depositing votive offerings into watery spaces. And then we see deposits of weapons, jewellery, tools into rivers in the 9th and the 10th centuries. So you may be thinking, okay then, Sharon, well, fair enough, but wasn't it just the Scandinavian heathen people that were doing this? No, it wasn't. Yes, they were doing it, and some of the objects dating from this period are Scandinavian objects. But what we also see is that Anglo Saxon objects were also being deposited in this time, in this later period, the 9th and the 10th centuries. So we can imagine that the influence of their Scandinavian cousins in this country would have reignited this ancient pagan tradition of putting offerings, votive offerings, into liminal watery spaces. So it's fair to say that in no way did the Vikings introduce this tradition into England. It had been happening for a long time before, but what their influence in this country does seem to have done is to reignite that and result in a re-blossoming of this tradition. Now, just an interesting example. Have you heard of Edith Swan Neck or Edith the Fair? Well, let me tell you a little bit about her. She was King Harold I, Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo Saxon king of this country. She was his wife. Now, although the Normans, don't get me started on the Normans, although the Normans said that she wasn't his wife, tried to denigrate her and call her his concubine, she was very much a loving wife in every sense of the word. Now, we don't know much about Edith, but we do know that she came from East Anglia, from my neck of the woods, and that she was a stunningly beautiful woman known for her beauty. She was also an incredibly rich woman. In fact, she was the second richest woman in this country after Queen Edith, Harold's sister. And she owned hundreds of manors across Suffolk and Cambridgeshire into Hertfordshire. Now, her mother, her name was Wulfgyf, and she was an Anglo-Saxon lady. But Edith's father, his name was Thorkil, and he was a Danish Viking. In fact, he was actually a Jomsviking, part of a warrior brotherhood. And they had a code of conduct, a code of honour, whereby if they killed a noble, they would be obliged to marry his widow. Now, Wulfgyf had been married to an Anglo-Saxon warrior who was presumably killed by Thorkil, and she then married this Jomsviking, Thorkil, and how she felt about this. I mean, you know, this guy's just killed her husband and now he's marrying her, but they did marry and they had 2 children, one of them being Edith, and believe the other one didn't survive, so that Edith was the only survivor, and we think she must have got her great wealth from her Danish Viking father. So here what we see is one of the most prominent figures at the death of the Anglo-Saxon period, and we see that she was a result of an Anglo-Danish marriage. So yes, we can see that the Vikings in the Danelaw, they did mix with the Anglo-Saxon families to the point of marrying into them. So we can see how there would have been quite a strong influence from these heathen Scandinavians that had set up home in England, because there was intermarrying. Indeed, Harold Godwinson was also the result of an Anglo-Danish marriage. You know, the last Anglo-Saxon king, his mother was in fact a Danish princess, a Danish noblewoman called Gyfu Thorkilsdottir. Now, because Harold and Edith were both from Anglo-Danish families, they were not actually married in a church, in a Christian ceremony. They were hand-fasted, a heathen pagan wedding ceremony. And it was for this reason that the Normans tried to say she wasn't his wife. In fact, you know, they tried to slander Harold as much as they possibly could. Well, they would do, wouldn't they? It was a big attempt to denigrate the Godwinson family and to bring shame upon them. But Harold was actually an amazing, decent man. Anyway, I'm sure that's a story for another day. So let's go back to these items being deposited. So the items date, as I said, the items dating from the 9th and the 10th centuries, you know, they were both Anglo Saxon and Scandinavian origins. And jewellery and tools, you know, these have been found in vast quantities from this later period. You know, the artefacts have been found again in the River Thames, the River Lee, the River Witham and the River Nene. Now, you know what I've done, don't you? I have forgotten to bring my Thames scram sacks, which I was going to wave around and talk about, because this is an object dating from the 10th century that was found in the River Thames, and it's extremely important to the study of the Anglo-Saxon runes as it is inlaid with the complete Futhorc. Anyway, I don't think I could have managed to carry it here anyway. I nearly didn't make it here with everything I did bring. So we can only speculate as to why somebody placed this magnificent Thames scram sacks into the Thames in the 10th century. We can only speculate, but I like to think that the pagan religion, although not official anymore, was still flourishing in this country at that time, and that was the reason for these deposits being made at this time. Of course, I don't know. I can only speculate. You know, who were these people making gifts to? Was it the gods? Was it the spirit of the place? We can only guess. Anyway, I shall end now. I'll be back with another episode. We're moving on to the Anglo-Saxon rune when. So I'd just like to say thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and subscribe if you haven't done it already. As I said, it's lovely to hear your comments. And so yeah, give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and if you can support my work through Patreon, that is very much appreciated. So I shall be back soon with another episode. So for now, it just remains to say farewell well and bēoþ hale.